As I mentioned at the onset of Mass, I'm a priest here of the Archdiocese, but I did not grow up in Baltimore. I actually grew up 3 hours north of here in a town called Scranton, Pennsylvania. And sometimes that creates a bit of a challenge because many of my family still live back in Scranton. And so sometimes it's frustrating to drive 3 hours to see my mom and dad. I'm also one of those crazy people that I actually like snow. And so they get a lot more snow than we do down here. But there are also many blessings and many benefits to being a priest 3 hours away from home. And one of those is that I can share stories in homilies about my family with great confidence that you won't run into any of them to tell them that I spoke of them. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to use one of those benefits today. You see, I have an older sister, and my sister and I are very close. And I love her a lot. But there's an interesting dynamic that occurs when she and I are trying to determine buying a gift for my parents. For example, if it was my parents' wedding anniversary, my sister will initiate the question, what do you think we should get mom and dad for their anniversary? And I'll come up with, I think, is a relatively reasonable suggestion and maybe say, how about we buy them a gift card to their favorite restaurant? If she says yes, then I know we're on the right path. But if she says, well, that's an idea, but then there are questions that follow, I know that this is not going to end well. Because what will happen is then she'll raise questions about, but mom and dad eat out a lot. Do you think they'd really want another gift card? They probably still have some in that they haven't used. Or, well, don't mom and dad really prefer to eat home? And then she'll say, well, but what do you think about Mom said that she needs a new lamp for the living room. And so I'll jump on that and I'll say, terrific, that's a great idea. No, but don't just agree with me because I suggested it. And we go back and forth until we finally conclude with what my sister had already thought would be the appropriate answer for the question, what to get my mom and dad for their anniversary. So in a sense, in that dynamic, there really isn't a sense of freedom in choosing. It's already been predetermined. But the exact opposite happens in today's gospel. Jesus doesn't cast a spell upon Peter, Andrew, James, and John. He doesn't do something where he robs them of their ability to choose and they just follow blindly. Jesus invites them to follow him, and they do so. And Matthew is intentional in telling us that they immediately follow him. It's not a matter of they sit back and ponder the invitation, discuss it with family members and friends, perhaps read up on who this Jesus person is. But Matthew is intentional in telling us that these men immediately, they left everything and they followed him. And so it begs the question for you and for me as we reflect on this beautiful gospel. Why? What is it that propelled them so much that immediately they follow the Lord? Well, I would suggest a few ideas. The first is, notice what Jesus does. Jesus meets these men where they're at. Jesus doesn't sit in some far-off temple waiting for people to come to him, but Jesus goes out to where they're familiar. He meets them where they're at. The second thing is that the invitation is individual. It's not casting this wide net to say, I don't really care who you are, I just need some help, so I'm going to cast this wide net, and whoever shows up, great, and whoever doesn't, you remain anonymous. No, Jesus calls them by name. There is that individual, very intimate and personal connection that Jesus has in his invitation to these men. And finally, Jesus accepts them for who they are. We can't think that God made some sort of mistake that he said, well, I chose Peter to follow me, and wow, did he disappoint me because later on he would deny me 3 times. Or, as we know, James and John got caught in the midst of being ambitious, to say the least, wanting to be on Jesus' left and right. Jesus didn't say, well, I made a mistake in calling these 2 as well. Not at all. Jesus was fully aware of the imperfections of these men, and yet he called them. He called them by name to follow him. My brothers and sisters, I guess it's the same reality that you and I are called to reflect on as well. What prevents us from responding immediately to God's call? And I think the answer is that we forget the invitation. I think that when we don't respond immediately to God's call, I think that that's a good way of defining sin, that in a sense we say no to what God is asking of us. And that only happens, and I can only speak for myself, but I suspect that you might have a shared experience, is I look back in the times that I say no to God, that I fall into sin. It's that I've forgotten one or all of the elements to today's invitation. The first is sometimes I forget that God is coming to me. I sometimes think that I can only encounter God in church. And so then that gives me license that outside the walls of the church, then I'm a bit freer that, well, I don't necessarily have to follow the gospel as closely as possible. Or when I'm not dressed like a priest, well, then maybe I don't have to be as kind as the Lord invites me. I forget that the Lord is with me, yes, here in a real and tangible way at Mass as the Word of God is proclaimed, and as we receive not a sign or a symbol, but His very presence in the Eucharist. But God is present with you and with me every step of our lives. The second thing that sometimes we forget and we fall into sin is that we forget that God calls us individually. We begin to falsely assume that our choices and decisions really don't matter, that we're just one of many. And so it doesn't matter how generous we are, or how quick we are to forgive, or whether we are forgiving. We think that it doesn't really matter, but it does. God calls you and He calls me individually by name, and He has great work for us to do. He has called us to go out into the world, in a world that so desperately is in need of the Lord. He depends on us to bring mercy and forgiveness, unity and happiness and joy, to focus our attention not on what divides us, but what unites us. Not to celebrate when people make mistakes, but to raise them up in those moments, and rather to rejoice when we see people are doing good things. But the last element of what I think we might forget when we fall into sin and do not immediately respond to God's voice in our lives, we forget that God accepts us for who we are. Not who we wish we were, who we hope to one day become, but He accepts you and I for who we are right now. And that's not to say that we enter into a world of relativism, that we say that it doesn't really matter how we act because God will always love us, although to a degree that's true. But rather, God accepts us for who we are. And I think for me and perhaps for you, when we sin, we feel as though that we can hide ourselves from God or pretend that we're someone that we're not. And when we do that, we create this distance between us and God that then allows sin to seep in. And so, brothers and sisters, it's an opportunity for us to celebrate God's great love for us, that He accepts us for who we are. He already knows, first and foremost, the goodness that dwells within us. But He also knows those areas that need a little bit of work, those aspects of our lives that we're trying to tweak. He even knows those parts of who we are that we're embarrassed about, or sometimes we make excuse for, or even worse, that we have fallen again and again so often that we begin to think that it's hopeless, that this sin or series of sin will always be part of who we are. God knows that about us as well, and still He calls us. He calls us to follow Him as we are, because the Lord knows that it is only in following Him, by being close to Him, that He can transform us. He can unite our strengths and also transform our weaknesses in a grace-filled moment, that we will recognize that we have power with God's help to overcome even the most burdensome sin that we experience. And so, brothers and sisters, I guess it's a long way of saying this. The takeaways from my homily, I hope, are this. First, if you have an older sister, just know that she's always right. But when it comes to the gospel, may we remind ourselves that the Lord calls us. He meets us where we're at. He calls us by name and accepts us for who we are. The more we remember that, the more that we allow that to penetrate our heart, the greater strength we will find that as the Lord calls us, our response will be like the men of today's gospel. We will leave everything behind and follow him in word and in deed without delay. We will follow him immediately.